The air in New Orleans hung thick and sweet that July morning, heavy with the promise of rain that never seemed to come. The Mississippi Delta breathed humidity into every corner of the city, turning starched collars limp and making even the simplest task feel like wading through molasses. In the colored section of Treme, where shotgun houses leaned against one another like exhausted neighbors, the First Baptist Church of the Redeemer stood as a beacon of hope amid the suffocating despair of the Depression. James Miller, a 23-year-old reporter for the Louisiana Weekly, wiped the sweat from his brow as he approached the church's white-painted doors. He was supposed to be covering a story about relief efforts in the Negro community, but the murmurs he'd heard at May's Diner that morning had pulled him in a different direction entirely. "You hear about Reverend Carter's church?" Old Samuel had whispered over his coffee, his rheumy eyes darting around the diner. 3 choir members sick as dogs, one of them ain't expected to make it. James had learned to trust Samuel's gossip. The old man knew everything that happened in Treme before it reached the newspapers, especially the stories white folks wouldn't bother to print. Inside the church, the sanctuary was blessedly cool, its high ceilings and thick walls holding off the worst of the heat. The wooden pews gleamed with years of polish, and the stained glass windows, donations from wealthier white congregations, cast colored shadows across the floor. James heard voices coming from a side room and followed them. He found Reverend Elijah Carter in his study, a small man with graying temples and worry lines etched deep into his dark face. Across from him sat his wife, Lillian, and James felt his breath catch. Even in distress, she was striking, tall and elegant, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold both fire and ice. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a modest blue dress that somehow managed to look fashionable despite its simplicity. "Reverend Carter," James said from the doorway. "James Miller from the Louisiana Weekly. I heard about the illness in your congregation. Wondered if you might spare a few minutes?" Elijah looked up, his expression one of exhaustion mixed with relief. "Mr. Miller, yes, please come in. We need people to know what's happening. The city don't pay much mind to colored folks' troubles, but maybe your paper will." Lillian rose gracefully from her chair. "I'll leave you gentlemen to talk. I should check on Sister Martha anyway." Her voice was cultured, with the careful diction of someone who'd worked hard to smooth out the rough edges of her upbringing. As she passed James, he caught the scent of lavender and something else, something bitter that he couldn't quite place. "Your wife directs the choir, doesn't she?" James asked once she'd gone. "Best soprano voice in New Orleans," Elijah said with a hint of pride that couldn't quite mask his worry. "Lillian's been a blessing to this church. Teaches Sunday school, organizes the ladies' auxiliary, keeps everything running smooth as silk. Don't know what I'd do without her." James pulled out his notebook. "Tell me about the illnesses. When did they start?" The Reverend's face darkened. 3 weeks ago, right after morning service. Sister Dorothy was the first. Started vomiting something fierce during the fellowship hour. Thought it was the heat at first, or maybe the potato salad had turned. But then Brother Thomas took sick the next Sunday, and little Clara Johnson the Sunday after that. All choir members? Every last one. Dorothy's still in Charity Hospital. The doctors, they're baffled. Say it looks like poison, but how could that be? "We're a church, Mr. Miller, a house of God," James wrote quickly, his reporter's instincts beginning to hum. "Has the health department been notified?" "They came by yesterday, said they'd test the well water and the church kitchen. But Mr. Miller, I got to be honest with you." Elijah leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There's been talk, ugly talk. Some folks saying it's more than bad water." "What kind of talk?" The Reverend's eyes flickered toward the door his wife had exited through. "Nothing I want to repeat. Gossip and speculation, that's all. You know how people get when they're scared." But James had been a reporter long enough to recognize the weight of unspoken words. He changed tactics. "What can you tell me about the choir? How long have these members been singing with you?" "Most of them years. Dorothy and Thomas were here before I took over this pulpit 5 years ago. Clara's newer, maybe 8 months. She's got a voice like an angel, that girl. Had, I should say. Doctor says even if she recovers, her throat's so damaged she might never sing again. James noticed how Elijah's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Reverend, forgive me for asking, but has there been any conflict in the church? Any disputes or disagreements? The question hung in the humid air between them. Outside, someone began practicing scales on the church organ, the notes drifting through the walls like ghosts. Every church has its troubles, Elijah said carefully. Disagreements about money, about who should sing which solo, about whether we should allow certain kinds of music during service. But nothing that would drive someone to do something like this. And your wife, has she had any conflicts with the choir members? Elijah's face hardened. Lillian is a saint, Mr. Miller. She works herself to the bone for this church, for this community. If you're suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything, Reverend. I'm just trying to understand what happened here. Before Elijah could respond, Lillian appeared in the doorway again, her face composed, but her eyes sharp. Elijah, Doctor. Beaumont is here. He says he needs to speak with you about the test results from the Fellowship Hall. The Reverend stood quickly. If you'll excuse me, Mr. Miller, perhaps we can continue this conversation another time. James found himself alone with Lillian. She regarded him with an expression he couldn't quite read, part curiosity, part caution. You're the reporter, she said, not quite a question. Yes, ma'am. James Miller. I suppose you want to ask me questions too. She moved to the window, looking out at the cemetery behind the church, where weathered headstones tilted in the overgrown grass. Everyone does these days. The police, the health inspector, even some of the congregation, all wondering the same thing. How could this happen in a church? How do you think it happened, Mrs. Carter? She turned to face him, and James saw something flicker in her eyes, pain, perhaps, or anger. I think, she said slowly, that sometimes the things we love most can make us sick. The choir has always been my pride and joy, Mr. Miller. I poured my heart into it, trained those voices, chose every hymn, made sure everything was perfect. Her voice caught slightly. And now they're suffering and people look at me like I'm some kind of monster. Why would they think that? Lillian's laugh was bitter. Because I made the sweet tea for Fellowship Hour, Mr. Miller. Every Sunday for 5 years, my special recipe, sugar, lemon, a touch of mint from the garden. Everyone loved it. Dorothy used to say it was the best thing about coming to church. She paused, her hands clenching the windowsill. I suppose it doesn't look good, does it? The choir director makes the tea, and the choir gets sick. Did anyone else drink the tea? Of course, everyone did, but only the choir members got sick. She met his eyes directly. Doctor, Beaumont says they found something in the leftover tea from last Sunday. Arsenic, he thinks. Can you imagine? In my tea. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Mrs. Carter, did I poison my own choir? She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's what you were going to ask, wasn't it? That's what everyone wants to know. The answer is no, Mr. Miller. I did not, but someone did. And whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the choir always drank first, before anyone else. They knew about my tea. Before James could press further, voices rose from the hallway. Dr. Beaumont's clipped tones mixing with Elijah's anguished protests. Lillian's face went pale. You should go, she said quietly. This is about to get very ugly, and you don't want to be here for it. But James stayed rooted to the spot as 2 police officers entered the church, their faces grim. He watched as they spoke to Elijah, saw the Reverend's shoulders sag, heard Lillian's sharp intake of breath. Mrs. Lillian Carter, one of the officers said, his voice formal and cold. We need you to come with us for questioning. Another choir member died this morning, Sister Dorothy, and the evidence points to poison administered through the sweet tea you prepared. Lillian didn't move. She stood there, tall and proud, her face a mask that revealed nothing. I see, was all she said. Then she looked at James, and for just a moment he saw behind the mask. saw years of something dark and bitter and utterly controlled. Mr. Miller, I hope you'll tell the truth in your article, whatever that truth turns out to be. As they led her away, James noticed something that would haunt him for weeks to come. Lillian Carter walked out of that church with her head held high, but she didn't once look back at her husband. And Elijah, watching his wife being taken by the police, wore the expression of a man who'd already known this moment was coming, had perhaps been waiting for it. The organ music had stopped. In the sudden silence, James heard the first drops of rain finally beginning to fall, tapping against the stained glass windows like accusations. He left the church with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. This was no simple case of food poisoning. This was murder, calculated and cold. And if Lillian Carter was responsible, then the question wasn't just who had died and how, it was why. What could drive a preacher's wife, a woman of God, to poison the very people she'd led in song? The answer, James would discover, lay buried beneath years of silence, shame, and secrets that the church had worked very hard to keep hidden. The rain that had started the day of Lillian's arrest continued for 3 days straight, turning the streets of Tremé into rivers of mud and forcing James to wade through ankle-deep water to reach his interviews. But rain or shine, he was determined to understand what had happened at First Baptist Church of the Redeemer. His first stop was Charity Hospital, where Thomas Crawford, the bass singer, was recovering. James found him in a ward crowded with patients, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and suffering. Thomas was a big man, but illness had hollowed him out, leaving him gaunt and grey. "You want to know about Sister Lillian?" Thomas said, his voice rough. It wasn't a question. "Everyone does. Police been here twice already." "I want to know the truth, Mr. Crawford, that's all." Thomas closed his eyes, and for a moment James thought he'd fallen asleep. But then he spoke, each word seeming to cost him effort. "The truth. The truth is complicated, Mr. Miller. Lillian Carter is a complicated woman." "How so?" "She came to that church 8 years ago, right after she married Reverend Carter. Beautiful voice, educated, refined. Everything a preacher's wife should be. But there was always something hard about her, like she was holding herself together with pure will." "Did she have conflicts with the choir?" Thomas's laugh turned into a coughing fit. When he recovered, his eyes were watering. "Conflicts? Mr. Miller, Lillian Carter ran that choir like a general running an army. She was strict, demanding. If you missed a note, she'd drill you for an hour. If you were late to rehearsal, you didn't sing that Sunday. But we respected her. She made us good. Made us sound like angels." "What changed?" Thomas looked away, toward the rain-streaked window. "About 6 months ago, Dorothy started talking. You know how Dorothy was. Couldn't keep a secret if her life depended on it." He paused, the irony of his words hanging heavy. "She said she'd seen the Reverend, seen him with Clara Johnson after choir practice one night. Said they were too close, too familiar." James felt something click into place. Clara, the youngest choir member. Just 19, pretty girl, sweet voice, and lonely. Her family had moved up from the country, and she was still finding her way in the city. The Reverend, he took her under his wing, said he was helping her, mentoring her. Thomas's voice grew bitter. Maybe that's all it was, but Dorothy didn't think so. And once Dorothy started talking, others started watching, started seeing things. What did they see? Little things. The Reverend giving Clara money for necessities. Finding them alone in his study with the door closed. The way he'd touch her arm during conversations. Nothing improper exactly, but familiar. And Clara, she started wearing nicer dresses, had money for things her family couldn't afford. Did anyone confront the Reverend? Thomas shook his head slowly. "You don't understand what it's like in our community, Mr. Miller. The Reverend? He's more than just a preacher. He's a leader, someone people look up to. And in these hard times, with so many folks depending on the church for food, for hope, who wants to tear that down? Who wants to admit that their spiritual leader might be—" He trailed off. So the choir knew, but said nothing. Not to his face, but amongst ourselves. The whispers got louder, and Dorothy, she couldn't keep quiet, started making comments during rehearsals, little digs about sin and hypocrisy. Nothing direct, but everyone knew what she meant. And Lillian— Thomas closed his eyes again. Lillian heard it all, every word. You could see it in her face, how it was killing her, but she never said nothing, just kept directing the choir, kept smiling, kept being the perfect preacher's wife, until she started making the tea. She'd been making that tea for years, Mr. Miller, but about 3 months ago she changed the recipe, said she'd found a better one, sweeter. We all loved it. Used to joke that we came to church more for Sister Lillian's tea than for the Reverend's sermons. He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a terrible understanding. That's when the symptoms started. Nothing obvious at first, just headaches, stomach upset. We blamed the heat, blamed the depression diet, but it got worse week by week. James leaned forward. Mr. Crawford, do you believe Lillian Carter poisoned the choir? The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of rain and distant moaning from other patients. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I believe, he said carefully, that Lillian Carter loved her husband, and I believe that love can make people do terrible things when it's poisoned by betrayal. Whether she put arsenic in that tea, I can't say for certain. But I know this. The day before I got really sick, Dorothy told me she was planning to go to the church board, said she had proof about the Reverend and Clara, and she couldn't stay silent anymore. She said someone had to protect Lillian's dignity, even if Lillian wouldn't do it herself. And Dorothy died. Dorothy died, Thomas confirmed. And Clara's in a coma, and I'm lying here wondering if maybe Dorothy was right about more than just the Reverend's infidelity. Maybe she was right to be afraid. James left the hospital with his mind racing. He needed to talk to someone who could give him another perspective, someone who'd known Lillian before she became the preacher's wife. It took him 2 days of asking around, but he finally tracked down Viola Washington, who'd grown up with Lillian in the 7th Ward. Viola lived in a small apartment above a laundry, and she invited James in with obvious reluctance. She was a thin woman with suspicious eyes and hands that never stopped moving, folding and refolding a dishcloth as she spoke. Lillian and me, we were friends once, Viola said, not quite looking at James, before she got too high and mighty for the likes of me. Tell me about her. What was she like as a girl? Viola's laugh was harsh. Lillian Dubois, that's what she was then. Prettiest girl in the ward, and she knew it. But pretty don't pay the bills, Mr. Miller. Her mama cleaned houses for white folks, and her daddy, well, he wasn't around much. Lillian, she was determined to be something more. Taught herself to read and write proper, practiced her singing until her voice was smooth as silk, studied how rich ladies talked and moved. She was ambitious. She was desperate, Viola corrected, desperate to escape. When she was 16, there was a boy, Jacques, his name was, worked on the docks. He loved her something fierce, and she loved him back, or so she said, but Jacques had no money, no prospects. Then Reverend Carter came to preach at our church. He was young then, just starting out, but everyone could see he was going places. And Lillian, she set her sights on him like a hunter tracking prey. She pursued him, made sure she was in the front row every Sunday, volunteered for every church activity he led, sang solos that brought tears to people's eyes. The Reverend, he didn't stand a chance. 6 months later they were married, and Lillian finally had what she wanted: respectability, security, a position in society. What about love? Viola met his eyes for the first time. What about it? You think love matters when you're poor and colored in Louisiana, Mr. Miller. Lillian did what she had to do to survive. Can't fault her for that. But you do fault her for something. The dishcloth stilled in Viola's hands. Jacques killed himself, she said flatly. 3 months after Lillian married the Reverend, walked into the Mississippi and didn't walk back out. Left a note saying he couldn't live in a world where the woman he loved had chosen God's money over God's love. She paused. Lillian never even came to his funeral. James felt a chill despite the humid heat. Did she ever show any regret? Regret? Viola's voice rose. Lillian Carter don't do regret, Mr. Miller. She does what needs doing, and she don't look back. That's who she is. Always has been. Cold and hard and practical as stone. Do you think she poisoned her choir? Viola was quiet for a long moment. I think, she finally said, that Lillian built her whole life around being the Reverend's wife. It was her escape, her purpose, her identity. And I think if someone threatened that, if someone was going to expose her husband's sins and tear down everything she'd worked for, well, I think Lillian would do whatever it took to protect what was hers, even if it meant she didn't finish the sentence. As James walked back through the rain-soaked streets, he thought about what he'd learned. A woman who'd sacrificed love for security, a husband who might have betrayed that sacrifice. A choir full of witnesses to that betrayal, with one woman, Dorothy, threatening to make it public. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was darker than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about poison in a teacup. It was about years of silence, swallowed pride, and a woman who'd traded her heart for respectability, only to watch that respectability crumble before her eyes. And somewhere in that toxic mixture of shame, betrayal, and wounded pride, murder had taken root. The trial of Lillian Carter began on a Monday morning in late August, when the heat had reached its most brutal peak. James sat in the segregated section of the courtroom, his notebook balanced on his knee, watching as the all-white jury filed in. He'd spent the past month digging deeper into the story, and what he'd found had kept him awake most nights. Lillian sat at the defense table in a simple black dress, her hair pulled back severely, her face composed. She looked every inch the respectable preacher's wife, even now, but James had learned to see past that mask. He'd interviewed too many people, heard too many stories, uncovered too many secrets. The prosecution's case was damning. They presented evidence of arsenic found not just in the sweet tea, but in Lillian's own kitchen, hidden in the bottom of her sugar jar. They called witnesses who testified to her increasingly erratic behavior in the months before the poisonings. They presented letters Clara Johnson had written to her mother, describing how Reverend Carter had been her special friend and mentor, letters that painted a picture of impropriety, if not outright adultery. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source, Reverend Elijah Carter himself. James watched as the Reverend took the stand, his shoulders slumped, his face haggard. The prosecutor, a thin white man named Henderson with sharp features and a sharper tongue, approached him like a predator circling wounded prey. Reverend Carter, Henderson began, tell the court about your relationship with Miss Clara Johnson. Elijah's voice was barely audible. Clara was a member of my congregation. I was helping her adjust to city life, providing guidance. Financial guidance? Henderson interrupted. The court has records showing you gave Miss Johnson over $50 in the past 6 months, during the Depression, Reverend, when your own church was struggling to feed its members. She needed help. Her family was... Did your wife know about these payments? Elijah's silence was answer enough. Did you have an inappropriate relationship with Miss Johnson? No, Elijah said firmly. I never touched that girl. I never... But your wife believed you did, didn't she? And Dorothy Miller, the woman who died first, she believed it too. In fact, she told multiple people she was going to bring evidence of your affair to the church board. Elijah's eyes found Lillian across the courtroom. She sat perfectly still, her face revealing nothing. Lillian and I, he said slowly, had our difficulties. What marriage doesn't? But I never believed she would. Did you know about the arsenic in your home? No. Did your wife ever threaten the choir members? Elijah hesitated, and James leaned forward. This was it, the moment of truth. There was one night, Elijah said, his voice breaking, about 2 months before Dorothy died. Lillian and I had an argument. She'd heard the rumors, the whispers. She asked me if I'd been unfaithful. I told her no, told her Clara was just someone I was helping, and she... He stopped, swallowing hard. What did she say, Reverend? She said, "If you've shamed me, Elijah, if you've made me a fool in front of my own choir, I'll make sure everyone who knows about it regrets it." I thought she was just upset, speaking in anger. I never thought... His voice dissolved into sobs. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge banged his gavel. And Lillian Carter, for the first time since the trial began, allowed her mask to slip. James saw rage flash across her face, hot and pure, before she controlled it again. When the defense called Lillian to testify, James expected her to break down, to plead, to show some emotion. But she didn't. She walked to the stand with her head high, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth with a voice that didn't waver. Her lawyer, an older Negro attorney named Marcus Green, who'd taken her case pro bono, approached her gently. "Mrs. Carter, did you poison your choir?" "No," she said clearly, "I did not." "Can you explain the arsenic found in your sugar jar?" "I cannot. I never purchased arsenic. I never used it for any purpose. Someone must have placed it there to implicate me." "Who would do such a thing?" Lillian's eyes swept the courtroom, landing on her husband. Perhaps someone who wanted to protect themselves, someone who needed a scapegoat for their own sins. The implication hung in the air. Green pressed on. "Mrs. Carter, tell the court about your marriage." For the first time, emotion cracked through her composure. "My marriage," she said, her voice tight, "was a bargain. I gave up love, Mr. Green. I gave up the man I cared for, a good man who loved me truly, to marry a reverend, to have security, respectability, to escape poverty. And for 8 years I held up my end of that bargain. I was the perfect preacher's wife. I smiled when I wanted to scream. I supported my husband even when he made my life a prison. I directed that choir, taught those children, made that tea every Sunday because it was expected of me. And then my husband betrayed me. Not with his body, perhaps. I don't know if he actually sinned with Clara Johnson, but with his heart, with his attention, with his care. He gave her what he should have given me. And worse, everyone knew it. Everyone whispered about it. Dorothy made sure of that. Every rehearsal, every Sunday, I had to stand there and direct people who pitied me, who knew I was a fool." Her voice rose. Years of bottled rage finally finding release. "Do you know what that does to a woman, Mr. Green? To smile and sing and pretend everything is fine while your whole world crumbles. To be reduced to an object of gossip, a cautionary tale about trusting men. I hated them. I hated every single one of them for knowing, for seeing me brought so low." "But you didn't poison them?" Lillian's laugh was hollow. "I wanted to, Mr. Green. God help me. There were nights I fantasized about it, about making them all pay for their whispers, their knowing looks, their pity. But wanting something and doing it are two different things. I never put arsenic in that sugar jar. I never poisoned my tea. And if I'm to hang for having hateful thoughts, then half the women in this city should hang beside me." The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal, but Lillian held firm. She admitted to her anger, her bitterness, even her occasional violent fantasies. But she never admitted to murder. James left the courtroom that day with his head spinning. He'd covered dozens of trials, but never one quite like this. The evidence pointed to Lillian, the arsenic in her kitchen, her motive, her opportunity. But her testimony had revealed something else. A woman trapped by her own choices, destroyed by her husband's weakness, driven to the edge by public humiliation. That night, unable to sleep, James returned to his office and pulled out all his notes. He spread them across his desk and began to read through everything again, looking for something he might have missed. And then he found it. A detail in Thomas Crawford's statement that he'd overlooked before. Lillian changed her tea recipe about 3 months ago. 3 months. The symptoms had started gradually, getting worse over time. But arsenic poisoning didn't work that way. It was either acute, large doses causing immediate violent symptoms, or chronic, building up over weeks and months until it finally killed. If Lillian had been poisoning her choir, she'd been doing it slowly, methodically, for months. Not in a sudden rage, but with cold calculation. Week after week, Sunday after Sunday, watching them drink her tea, watching them sicken, waiting for them to die. The thought made James's blood run cold, because that kind of patience, that kind of sustained cruelty, that wasn't the act of a woman driven to desperate violence in a moment of passion. That was the work of someone who'd planned every detail, who'd decided that certain people deserved to suffer, and who'd had the discipline to carry it through no matter how long it took. If Lillian Carter was guilty, she was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The verdict came on a sweltering Friday afternoon. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, some wept. Lillian Carter stood motionless as the judge sentenced her to death by hanging. James watched her face and saw nothing. No fear, no regret, no anger, just a terrible emptiness, as if she'd already left her body and was watching from somewhere far away. But James couldn't let it go. Something about the case still nagged at him, some piece that didn't quite fit. So he kept digging. Even as the newspapers moved on to other stories, even as the Negro community of Treme tried to heal from the scandal that had torn through their midst. 2 weeks after the verdict, James received an unexpected visitor at his office. Clara Johnson, miraculously recovered from her coma, stood in his doorway. She was thin and pale, her once beautiful voice reduced to a raspy whisper, but her eyes were clear and determined. "I need to talk to you," she said. "About what really happened." James offered her a chair and waited. Clara sat down carefully, as if her body still hurt, and began to speak. "Reverend Carter never touched me," she said first. "Not the way people thought. He was kind to me, that's all. My family was starving, Mr. Miller, my little brothers and sisters going to bed hungry every night. The Reverend, he gave me money to help feed them. That's all it was." "Then why didn't you testify?" "Because I was afraid. Afraid of what people would think, afraid I'd make things worse, and because—" She stopped, tears filling her eyes. "Because I knew the truth, and the truth is worse than what they accused him of." James leaned forward. "What truth?" "Sister Lillian knew there was no affair. She knew the Reverend was just helping me, but she didn't care. She wanted people to think there was something improper, wanted the gossip to spread. Because as long as everyone was watching the Reverend, no one was watching her." "I don't understand." Clara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 3 months before I got sick, I saw something. I was at the church late one night, practicing a solo for Sunday. I heard voices from the Reverend's study, Sister Lillian and a man, not the Reverend, someone else. They were arguing about money. The man said she owed him, that he'd kept her secret all these years, but his silence wasn't free anymore. He wanted $200, or he'd tell everyone about Jacques. Jacques? The man she loved before she married the Reverend. Clara nodded. But it wasn't about lost love, Mr. Miller. The man said Jacques hadn't killed himself. He said Sister Lillian had pushed him into the river, that he saw it happen, saw them arguing on the dock, saw her shove him when he tried to grab her arm. He'd been blackmailing her for years, taking money from the church treasury a little at a time, and Sister Lillian covering it up. James felt the pieces suddenly click into place. And when Dorothy started nosing around, started paying attention to church finances and the Reverend's activities, she was getting too close to discovering the missing money. Sister Lillian needed a distraction, something to divert everyone's attention. So she encouraged the gossip about me and the Reverend. Made sure people were watching him, suspecting him, so they wouldn't look at her. But why poison the choir? Why not just silence Dorothy? Clara's tears fell freely now. Because Dorothy wasn't the only one who knew. Thomas had figured out the money was missing. I'd seen the blackmailer, and Sister Lillian, she decided the only way to be safe was to get rid of all of us. The poison was slow enough that it looked natural at first, gave her time to establish the rumor that the Reverend was having an affair. By the time we got really sick, everyone was already primed to believe that a betrayed wife had snapped. She set it all up, Mr. Miller, every detail, made herself look like the victim while she was actually the architect of it all. Why are you telling me this now? Why not tell the police? Because I have no proof, Clara said bitterly. It's my word against a convicted murderess. Who's going to believe me? But you're a reporter. You can dig deeper, find evidence. And maybe, her voice broke, maybe you can stop her from taking the final secret to her grave. What secret? The blackmailer's name. Who he was. Where to find him. Because if Sister Lillian goes to the gallows without revealing that, he gets away with everything, with covering up Jacques' murder, with stealing from the church, with driving her to kill 4 people. Justice should catch everyone guilty, Mr. Miller, not just the ones who got caught. James spent the next week following Clara's lead. He found financial records that showed small, regular withdrawals from the church treasury going back years. He tracked down people who'd known Jacques, who remembered seeing Lillian and her former lover arguing on the dock the night he died. He found the blackmailer, a deacon named Samuel Pritchard, who'd worked at the church for 15 years and who suddenly couldn't explain where he'd gotten the money to buy a house during the Depression, but he couldn't prove it. Every lead ended in hearsay, every witness was dead or unreliable, every document could be explained away. The only person who knew the whole truth was Lillian herself. So James did something he'd never done before. He requested a meeting with the condemned woman. They met in the prison's visiting room, separated by iron bars. Lillian looked older than her 32 years. Her beauty faded by imprisonment, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Mr. Miller," she said, "still looking for your story?" "I'm looking for the truth, Mrs. Carter, and I think you're the only one who can give it to me." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The truth. What an interesting concept. The jury found their truth. The newspapers printed their truth. What makes you think there's any other truth to find? I know about Jacques. I know about Samuel Pritchard. I know about the blackmail and the missing money. I know you set up your own husband to take the fall for murders you committed to protect yourself. Lillian's expression didn't change. And yet here I sit, convicted and condemned. What difference does any of that make now? It makes a difference to Clara Johnson, to Thomas Crawford, to the families of the people you killed. They deserve to know why. They deserve to understand. Deserve. Lillian's laugh was bitter. Let me tell you about deserve, Mr. Miller. I deserve to be loved. I deserve to marry a man I chose, not a man I needed. I deserve to live without being blackmailed for a crime I committed in self-defense when Jacques tried to force me to run away with him. I deserved not to spend years watching my husband become a saint in everyone's eyes while I played the dutiful wife. Do you know what it's like to give up everything you are, to become what everyone needs you to be? To sacrifice your whole self on the altar of respectability? So you killed them. Dorothy, Thomas, Clara, I killed the gossips and the witnesses, she interrupted. I killed the people who would have destroyed the life I'd built, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. Was it right? No. Was it just? No. But it was survival, Mr. Miller, pure survival. And if you think you wouldn't do the same if you were backed into a corner with no way out, then you don't know yourself very well. What about Samuel Pritchard? Will you let him go free? For the first time, Lillian's composure cracked. Her hands gripped the bars between them. Samuel Pritchard, she said, her voice low and venomous, will answer for his sins in his own time. I've left him a legacy that will ensure it, letters hidden where they'll be found after I'm gone, evidence that will see him hang right alongside my memory. He thought he could use me, could bleed me dry, and then watch me die. But I've made sure he'll follow me to hell. You planned this, all of it. Of course I planned it. When have I ever done anything that wasn't planned, calculated, thought through to every detail? I've spent my entire life planning, Mr. Miller, planning my escape from poverty, planning my marriage, planning my respectability. And when all of that was threatened, I planned my revenge. The only thing I didn't plan was getting caught. But perhaps, she paused, her eyes distant, perhaps part of me wanted to get caught. Perhaps I was tired of planning, tired of pretending, tired of being the perfect preacher's wife who swallowed every humiliation with a smile. James looked at this woman who'd killed 4 people to protect a life she'd never wanted in the first place, and he felt something unexpected, not sympathy exactly, but a kind of terrible understanding. She was a victim of her own choices, trapped by the very respectability she'd murdered to maintain. "Will you confess? Officially, I mean. Clear your husband's name?" Lillian's smile was cold. "Elijah will carry his guilt for the rest of his life, not for adultery. He was innocent of that mostly, but for his weakness, his failures as a husband. Let him live with that. Let him wonder if he drove me to murder. It's a lighter burden than I've carried." "And the choir? The people you poisoned?" The choir sang hymns about mercy and grace while they gossiped about my humiliation. They prayed for the poor while they watched my marriage crumble and did nothing. Dorothy Miller made it her mission to expose every secret, to judge every sin, everyone's sin but her own. Thomas Crawford stood silent when he could have stood up for me. Clara Johnson was innocent, I'll grant you that, but she was also a witness, and witnesses are dangerous. She stood, preparing to return to her cell. "Write your story, Mr. Miller. Tell them about the preacher's wife who poisoned the choir. Tell them about the woman who killed for respectability and got death for her troubles. But tell them this too. I did what I had to do, and given the same choices, knowing the same outcome, I'd do it all again. Because the alternative, being exposed, humiliated, cast out, that was a death too. I just chose to take some people with me when I fell." As the guards led her away, James sat in the visiting room for a long time, his notebook untouched. He thought about Jacques, drowned in the Mississippi for the crime of loving too fiercely, about Dorothy and Thomas and Clara, poisoned for the crime of seeing too much, about Elijah Carter, who would spend the rest of his life haunted by his wife's confession and his own blind innocence. And he thought about Lillian herself, who'd traded love for security, killed for pride, and would hang for her refusal to accept the role society had assigned her. The story James wrote for the Louisiana Weekly ran the day before Lillian's execution. It was the most honest piece he'd ever written, pulling no punches about her guilt while also examining the circumstances that had created a murderer. He wrote about poverty and pride, about the impossible standards placed on women, especially colored women, in Depression-era New Orleans. He wrote about a church that preached forgiveness but practiced judgment, about a community that valued respectability over truth. The letters Lillian had mentioned were found exactly where she'd said they'd be, hidden in the church organ. Samuel Pritchard was arrested, tried and convicted of blackmail and accessory to murder. He hanged 2 months after Lillian did. The First Baptist Church of the Redeemer never quite recovered. Reverend Elijah Carter resigned and left New Orleans, disappearing into the vast anonymity of northern cities. The building stood empty for years until another congregation bought it, painted over its history, and tried to start fresh. But in Tremé, people remembered. They told the story of the preacher's wife who poisoned the choir, and with each telling it grew larger, stranger, more mythic. Some said she was a wronged woman driven to madness. Others said she was evil incarnate, a serpent in human form. The truth, as James had learned, was both more complex and more tragic than either extreme. Years later, James would still think about Lillian Carter, standing proud and unrepentant on the gallows, her final words a hymn sung in that beautiful soprano voice, a voice that had once led a choir in praise and had ultimately sung 4 people to their graves. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. She'd sung it perfectly, every note pure and clear. And as the trapdoor opened and silence fell, James understood the final bitter irony. Lillian Carter had spent her whole life performing for an audience, playing a role she'd never chosen. In the end, even her death was a performance, One last hymn, one last perfect note, and then nothing but the echo of what might have been if mercy had ever found a place to grow in soil so poisoned by judgment, hypocrisy, and the suffocating demands of respectability. The story ended, but its lessons remained. That righteousness can rot from within, that victims can become villains, and that sometimes the line between devotion and damnation is as thin as a single grain of arsenic dissolved in sweet tea on a sweltering Sunday morning in New Orleans.